Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Today's guest is Shruthi Vijayakumar, a coach and educator based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, hailing from South India, but at heart a global citizen. As today's topic touches on how one is able to step off the rat race and find fulfillment beyond one's own personal needs, I will rattle off some of Shruthi's illustrious background to provide some context. Shruthi is an alumni of the University of Oxford, the World Economic Forum Global Shaper, former Boston Consulting Group consultant, and Westpac Bank's advisory panel member. And instead of continuing to chase these traditional metrics of success, Shruthi now coaches social impact-driven business leaders and change makers, supporting them with their inner well-being and in creating organizations and societies that foster the well-being of people and nature. She does this by harnessing the wisdom across indigenous, Eastern, and Western knowledge systems. Welcome, Shruthi.
Thank you so much for having me, Angela. Welcome to you all, and looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, maybe to kick us off, we talk about these conventional success metrics, like the roles that you've been part of and the higher education universities that you've gone to in terms of Ivy League universities. What have been your experiences navigating these metrics and especially in the context of what we love to talk about, which is a lot of this is social conditioning, where we're told how we should live and what we should value. Passing it on to you, Shruthi, to share a little bit about your journey so far.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. It's a big question, hey? How we navigate these different metrics and measures of how we should live a good and meaningful life. If we kind of start maybe at your last point around social conditioning, I think at the very essence of it, our society conditions how we think and how we feel, the products of our environment to a large degree, unless we are highly critical and questioning and self-aware, which is quite hard work, but something we can very much commit to do. And if we look at, say, Auckland, where I'm based, Tamaki Makaurau, we live in a pretty modern capitalist context. And here, in this kind of context that I've been raised in, success is very much viewed as an accumulation of wealth. If I had to put it in a simple sense, our economies measure success by how much our GDP grows, how much stuff we're producing and consuming and making. Our companies measure success by how much money we make, how much profits we produce. And even as individuals, largely, at least unconsciously, we're very conscious of our bank balance and how much money we're making. And if it's not money, it's still very much an accumulation of stuff, be it power, be it privilege, be it status, be it stuff, be it a partner or a house or something external that's going to fulfill me. I think in all of these, we see kind of traditional success as something external that's going to somehow fulfill me internally. And I think one of the funny things is, Angela, I've noticed in my life, and a lot of research shows this as well, when you fulfill one desire, another desire comes and another desire comes. And that satisfaction is really momentary. For that moment that you've achieved that milestone, I've run that marathon, I've secured that promotion, I've gotten into that university. Oh, wow, you feel this moment of fulfillment. And then the next desire arises. What's next? What's the next promotion? What's the next step on the ladder? What's the next achievement? Now that I've got into the university, I've got to get to that amazing job. And so we're kind of constantly sort of unhappy and constantly seeking. And one of my favorite quotes is from Stephen Covey. He says, many of us are so busy climbing the ladder that we get to the top and then we realize, oh my God, the ladder was leaning against the wrong building all along. I might have this fancy job or this title or this money or whatever it might be, but am I really happy? And what's been the cost to the environment and to people in that context? And so to put this in a kind of real way to my own experience, one of my first job out of university was working, as Angela said, for Boston Consulting Group as a big management consultant. And it was one of those moments when everyone around me was really sort of impressed and congratulating me. My parents were stoked that I had a stable job. For them, security was key because they had to work very hard. They weren't asking what's purposeful and meaningful. The question was, how do I put food on the table? How do I give my daughters a life better than what I had? So they were happy. I was financially secure. I had a reputable firm. I was secure and stable. Some friends around me, not all of them, but some were very impressed by the fine dining, and I was often traveling and staying in these great hotels. And externally, it seemed to measure up to this apparent societal definition of success. Internally, Angela, I struggled. The longer I was a consultant, the more insecure I became. I was more worried what people thought of me. Am I dressing appropriately? What do I say? Like, I just noticed the anxiety grow. I was more insecure about my performance. My self-confidence was a measure of how I was being evaluated. If I got good feedback, I felt great. If I didn't get very good feedback on my Excel model, apparently I'm not a good person. I'm not worth it. So I saw how in many ways my inner well-being really deteriorated. My physical health struggled. My relationship struggled. I was working long days, often 12, 14-hour days, desperately trying to be enough by this external measure that my company was measuring my performance by. And to be honest, it was probably one of the low points in my physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being as a whole. That said, I'm grateful for the time there. I learned a lot. It gave me many, many gifts in my own journey. But it was interesting, the comparison between externally, the world's going, wow, you've made it. This is great. This is a successful start to your career. And internally, I was like, this is not wellness. This is not thriving. This is not flourishing. And so maybe without kind of going on too much, but to sort of bring it together, I think for me, navigating these metrics is about really asking ourselves some hard questions about, what is fulfillment? What is well-being? What is happiness? What is really important to us at the end of the day? And so much research shows us to a point, wealth is necessary to meet our needs, to, live a reasonably, it doesn't have to be a lavish life, but to meet our needs physically, of course. But beyond that, it's the strength of our communities, the strength of our connection. It's our relationship with nature. It's a sense of contribution to a cause bigger than us. Like, these are the qualities that really fulfill us more meaningfully. And a more equal society is a big part of that. So we're not comparing and wishing we had more. And ultimately, I would say, really, finding success, or some measure of success for me, is so much about just navigating my mind and feeling content and feeling grateful. It's very much an inner journey, less an external journey. It's very much about finding joy in the moment, in every step in the process, rather than getting to some outcome that will apparently give me success, but only for a moment give me some happiness before I'm waiting for the next thing. So I'll pause there, Angela, but those are to pick us up.
Those are like really great reflections, right? When I think about, there are a few things that you've said there. One is that we project and want external validation to help us feel well internally, rather than actually doing the hard work of the internal bits that help us feel well. And I'm sure we will talk about that subsequently. But I think there are a few examples that are much more high profile for what you've talked about. So for example, there's this term like post-Olympic depression, where Michael Phelps, who's like the most decorated Olympian with all the gold medals that he's won, and he always dreads once he gets it, because he's like, it for that moment after he's worked so hard, he's got the gold medal, and then he crashes. And often a lot of those examples that you've given, I've gotten to the Ivy League universities, I've gotten this like management consulting job that all my classmates wanted to get in. And then when you get it, and then you realize the reality is often like, it's this mismatch around your expectation. Like you said, the expectation that, if I get this, then I will now be happy forever. And that's not true. And I think it's really great for you to be able to be self-aware enough to recognize, okay, externally, everybody says like, this is amazing. But in like what I know, really it's not, because my physical health is affected, my relationships are affected, I'm waking up anxious, I don't have peace of mind. And really what you're trying to think about is peace of mind. You drop this sort of like, casually, just like, what is fulfillment, what is well-being, what is happiness? I mean, like, from your perspective, how would you define those things? Because I think that a lot of our listeners will be asking those questions and searching on the internet, and kind of maybe there's still this disconnect between what I read on the internet versus like how I'm actually feeling. So how do you marry those two things up?
Wow, what a big question. What is peace of mind? What is happiness? What is fulfillment? I mean, one place that I need to start with, maybe really practically, is it's having one's basic needs met. Like, if we're hungry, if we are unable to feed our children, if we are in an abusive situation, if we're on the streets, like I think there's a base level of material needs that need to be met for us to be well. One of my spiritual teachers says, never try and talk high philosophy, teach meditation to someone who's hungry on the street. They just need food in their belly. So at a base level, we need to create a society, not only for us, but for everyone. Because I think if others are hungry, if others are suffering, I can't be well. I might apparently think I'm this separate self. Maybe get a little bit philosophical here, Angela. From a Western, modern Enlightenment context, there's people like Rene Descartes who've really made us view humans as separate from each other and separate from nature. And it's this mechanistic understanding that we're individual beings that need to compete so we're well enough that underpins capitalism. A lot of our indigenous philosophies, a lot of our Eastern philosophies, and even our ancient Western philosophies, you look at the Druids from Ireland, for example, talk about our existence or our reality as being deeply interconnected, just like nature. If one fish gets overfished, the whole nature's ecosystem goes off balance because the next fish doesn't have enough food, and then there's two, they die out and the next one can't feed on it, and the whole ecosystem gets disrupted. Similarly, as people, we're interdependent. We live in an interconnected society. To think that we're in this insulated bubble is not true. We see it with the pandemic. We see it with climate change. What happens in one corner of the earth affects everyone. Our supply chains are so interconnected at a business level, at an ecological level, at a mental level. And so if others can't be well, I think at some level we can't be well. If nature is not healthy and well, we can't be well. If the air is polluted, of course my body is going to be sick. If the water is polluted, if my food lacks nutrition, of course I'm not going to be well. So to kind of go back to the question, at one level, it's meeting our basic needs. It's ensuring the basic needs of others are met so we can all have our needs met. It's ensuring the environment is well and clean. And then I think
sorry, just to quickly interrupt. And I think you talked about, you still need a basic level of income so that you don't worry about, so that I can pay rent, so that I could put food on the table. So happiness does correlate with money, but to a degree. Then after that, it starts to plateau, which is kind of, which is kind of what you're alluding, right? Like, look, we need our basic needs met. We should, ideally, we should have that met in a fair and equitable way across the community. But then, hey, let's talk about what that means then once you've achieved those basic needs.
100%. Yeah, beautifully summarized. And I imagine for many of us on this webinar, the fact that we're on this webinar probably reflects that we're not stressed about our basic needs. Sometimes we are. We're mentally stressed about finances all the time, but that's our minds. But the reality is, I imagine most of us here are fairly privileged. So it's important to acknowledge the fact that we're thinking about these things probably means we're at a level both to uplift others and to really ask the next questions of ourselves. And I think at that point, one way to look at it, Angela, and this is again one of the teachings of one of my spiritual teachers, Sai Baba, who talks about one equation for happiness, to be a bit mathematical. He talks about desires fulfilled over desires entertained. And so what that basically means is, say it really simply, there are 50 things that I want, and I have 2 of them. Maybe it's a car, it's some clothes, it's a group of friends, it's this kind of recognition, it's this kind of contribution, 50 things I want, but I'm able to meet 10 of them. Okay, I'm 1/5 happy. So basically the number of things I'm able to meet or acquire versus the number of things mentally I want. And so there's 2 ways you could kind of pursue this. You could try and acquire more and more stuff, but what happens is the number of things you want keep growing. Or you could reduce the number of things you want. And so in a very technical sense, using this, it's one approach to think about happiness. More happiness or more wellness comes from wanting less things. And another way to look at that is being more grateful, being more content with what we have, focusing on what we do have, what we do enjoy. And there's no end. I'm sure you've probably talked about gratitude on this webinar. There's no end for the number of things we can be grateful for. The fact that I woke up alive, the fact that my body is functioning, the fact that I have all my senses intact, the fact that I can do meaningful work, the fact that I've got a family that cares for me, like I can see the sun shining today, I can eat good food, I can afford to spend time in my garden. Like there's no end to the number of things we can be grateful for. And often it takes us losing something to acknowledge it and to be like, oh my God, I value my head because now I've got a headache and it's so frustrating.
I think, really what you're sort of saying as well is like there's the paradox of choice, right? I think as humans, we are so inundated by choice. And actually what we've seen across history is like, we don't necessarily want to go back to right at the back back in the days where like as a woman, your only choice was like you would be a housewife stuck at home, no career. But at the same time, sometimes like where we're at, especially like you said, as privileged individuals, on listening in about like whether I'm fulfilling my purpose or not, it is that meta level that we're looking at. And so thinking about what it means to sometimes have a little bit more of a minimalistic perspective, and instead of like we've heard of like FOMO, fear of missing out, but also
Mm.
there's another one I've heard is called like FOBO, which is like fear of the better option. Like even
Yeah,
when you pick the
so
option, you're
good.
like still at the back of your mind going like, wait, is that other option better? And so you're like never
Yeah,
content with like what
100%.
you have. So yes, I
100%.
think it's really interesting. Well, let's sort of come back to, okay, you had on the surface all these things that people say, wow, Shruthi, I wish I was you. And look, I can say that I've been in similar positions, and so then this idea then but then you started to recognize, well, it's not all it's cracked up to be. You don't get to see the 90% of the time where I wake up with a headache and I'm like not sure whether this is what I want in my life. What
Yeah.
was the trigger point? Like, what made you kind of go like, okay, well, this is not it? And then how did you even figure out what it
Yeah.
should be?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lovely question. One of them was working my first 24-hour workday, Angela. That's what I was texting. And I had done, I remember, a week of like 4 or 5 a.m. work days and was feeling the pressure of this client. And anyway, I couldn't set my own boundaries. I didn't even, now I would probably not even tolerate that. But at the time, that's what I was doing. And at that point, I was like, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. And I had it in my mind that I could stay with this consulting firm and then do social impact consulting or go overseas and do the secondment. And this was the path I had in my head. I had to stay in the firm and find these opportunities by doing my time and performing well enough. But that sort of moment had me questioning, like, maybe I don't need to stay here. I mean, it's funny how we get so narrow. Now I'm like, of course you don't have to stay there. You can do all these other things. But at the time, that was kind of what I saw as the path. And so it really opened up a period of exploring and going, what do I want to do? Part of my desire to get into consulting was to understand how business works and to see, could I be a force for good through business? I wasn't really able to do that. I could learn a lot, but I kind of came out of consulting going, I don't think business is the way I want to make change, at least right now, at least not through a consulting firm as a young woman of color. And so I began to question, like, who am I and what do I want to spend my time doing? A lot of it was having conversations with people that I thought were doing interesting things that seemed to be satisfied. And from each of these conversations would learn and kind of pick up new threads. One of the bits of advice I got was, think of 10 people that you think are doing really interesting work and just chat to them and just see where the conversations take you. And it was a serendipitous conversation with someone that led me to moving to India into a very simple community to do education work with an NGO that wanted to bring empathy and creativity and critical thinking, which was a shock to my family, was a shock to my community. What I earned in Australia in a month, I earned a year in India, but far more exciting, engaging intellectually, played to my strengths and deeply fulfilling to know, wow, by me doing my work in some humble way, we're trying to contribute to a better education system. And so you mentioned purpose. I think that could take any shape or form. I don't think it has to be this grand purpose of I need to change the world. Sometimes we've deluded ourselves into thinking we're so important with this big purpose. But I think for me right now, it's some contribution that's not about me. It's some way of living in a non-self-centered way. It might be about my child. It might be about being a great mother. It might be about my community. It might be about my garden. In our case, it was about dedicating our time to education and creating a better future for the children we were working with. And so that's been a transition.
I completely agree with you. I think when I think about what gives me purpose, it very much is less about what can I get out of it, but like, why am I doing this? Because there were many moments and and I assume we'll continue to have many moments moving forward where there will be tough times where you'll ask yourself, like, why not take the easy way out? Why not just take the paycheck that comes and pays well, and then 9 to 5, I don't have to think about my job. I just hang my head and I'm done for the day. And it's because for me, it's very much about the fact that there are all these things or problems in the world that I can't see people really meaningfully solving. And you talked about how you had to come to the conclusion that business is not the way to do social good for you. And I think we're on a crossroad ourselves. Like one of the things that I've been really consumed over the last 1 month is actually listening to a lot of like these business podcasts about what happened. So the latest one was about Exxon and the oil spill in Alaska,
Mm,
and
mm,
how, like, right at the beginning they shirked their responsibility to contain the mess, and then it really spread out, and then the jury found them guilty and was charged to pay
yeah.
$5 billion, and then they spent 10 years fighting it in court, so that like at the end of it, these families who 30 years on never see the lifestyle return only got paid out $100,000. And
Mm,
it made me so sad because, as you said, like these businesses have not really put our environment and the people around
mm,
us in mind, rather than just pure profit. And so as I think about Clearhead, how do we set up our business so that we can be a business that does social good,
mm.
and fight the good fight and show that there are examples. There were a couple of things that you talked about that I'd love to explore a little bit, before we sort of delve to the next question, which is, you talked about, like at that time, the reason you couldn't make that move earlier was you were not setting these boundaries. You felt like there was only this like one option. And one of those first steps you took to kind of broaden up those options and not feel trapped in the situation you're in was, you said, let's explore. Let's talk
Mm.
to 10 people who I find interesting, who might be living a different life for what I want. Yeah, maybe talk a little bit about why you felt like, as someone who technically was very, very intelligent and very successful, why could you not set boundaries? Because if you can't set boundaries, well, maybe other people can't set boundaries, and maybe other people will feel their options are narrow. So yeah, maybe talk through a little bit of that and how others can work themselves out if they're feeling trapped at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's a real humility, Angela. I look at I mean, I was just like 21, 22 at the time. You know, there's lots that I've learned since. So there's a humility, I think, about we don't know what we don't know. I don't think I felt very intelligent, to be honest. I was quite humbled by my limitations. So I think that's one thing. Hey, no matter how much experience we get, how do we keep that learner's mindset and be willing to learn from, all kinds of sources that we might least expect. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing. And then getting out of our circles, because the circle I was in was a very small bubble of people that valued certain things and thought in certain ways. And, there's a deep human need for belonging. It's probably something you've covered in this, these webinars, I'm sure, as well. And often our desire for belonging can be so big that we find it hard to really step back and see other options or see other possibilities. And so I think a big part of those conversations was just to get out of my bubble. But I was so kind of stuck in to explore realities and remind myself there are actually infinite ways we can design and live our lives. Our parents may not have had all those options just given their circumstance, but with a bit of privilege and a bit of with what technology is enabling and a bit of resource, like there's actually so many possibilities. And to step into that mind space is quite freeing and empowering, sometimes a bit paralyzing, but nonetheless, I think that's what getting out of our bubble, be it to remind ourselves of the realities of the most marginalized or just to explore what people in other industries or spaces or places are thinking is so important.
Yeah, when I look at the data that Clearhead sort of have around sort of these population level, like mental health data that we get, lacking purpose is one of the top three things consistently, especially post the pandemic. And one of the things that we've been exploring is like, how do we help people find purpose using digital tools? And very, very excited in the next few weeks to be able to release more
Mm-hmm.
information on that. But one of the things that we have figured out is it comes back down to, are you self-aware enough on your values and how you're living your values, whether in your personal relationships, whether at work, in your careers, whether in the hobbies that you entertain, in order to, once you have a clearer idea about like, okay, what are your values? Are you living them? Okay, you're not living them. Okay, what can I do to live more like what the values I aspire to have? And then I'm one step closer to being to living a purposeful life. I guess my question to you is like, did you ever assess personally what were your values and whether that played a part in your transition?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, Angela. One of the practices that I do fairly regularly, but used to do a lot in earlier years. Stephen Covey, I really love his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he's got a few practices there that I often do with my own coaching clients as well. One, he gets you to visualize your funeral and think about who would be there and what would you be remembered for? What's the kind of, in my case, sister, daughter, colleague, partner, potentially parent would I have wanted to have been? And you kind of look at yourself in the different roles you wear. And whenever I do this exercise, I used to do it annually, I then look at, okay, what are the different roles I have now? If this is what I want to be remembered for, how am I tracking in terms of how I am now? And I remember the first time I did this, I was like, I want to be a daughter that's really present for my parents and having meaningful conversation and a kind of relationship where we're learning and growing. And I realized, well, right now I don't really spend time or create the space for that. So it made me go, okay, if this is what I want, what am I going to do different? And I started having lunch with my dad once a week. It was a very practical thing, but it made a huge shift. And so that in terms of an exercise or a way to sense what's important to us, and from that actually pull out some values. I think some people find real value in naming them. And I've done this sometimes. Like for me, compassion was a big one. Dynamism and enthusiasm was a big one. So I like this. There were 4 or 5 values, but often, for me, if I don't label them in such an intellectual way, it's sort of just tuning into my heart or my deeper sense of knowing or my conscience, as we call it. And does this sit right? If I think about what really matters at the end of my life, does this sit right, and what might need to shift? And it's quite amazing how much we actually know if we just create space to tune in to the wisdom in us that's actually guiding us moment to moment.
That's great. And of course, I know you now as the person who transitioned. You are living a much more purposeful life, and you hinted at the coaching side of things. But maybe before we go into that next chapter of your life, there is obviously difficulty in transitioning, adjusting. And what was hard in the first year of that transition that you had to really be watchful of, because if not, you might easily fall back into that previous life that you have you've lived. So yeah, maybe talk through, because I think that's what people often fear about, like, oh, it would be too hard, or like you said, I would lose half my salary, and I'm used to this level of lifestyle. I can't take that job, that pay cut to work at this job that is more aligned with my values. Maybe talk through a little bit of that initial challenge of transitioning.
Yeah, it's a good question, Angela. I think one piece is just to make sure, someone told me this feedback when I was in Australia in this period, be careful that your decisions come from a place of love, purpose, passion, heart, not emotion, but heart, rather than fear. Love and fear I kind of see as these opposites. And I think often when we're staying and unwilling to transition, often there's all these fears arising. You name them beautifully. Will I be able to manage with the pay cut or whatever it might be? You don't have to have a pay cut all the time, but say that's the case. Would I be able to manage? And so one thing is the self-awareness of what's my relationship with this fear? And I love one thing Elizabeth Gilbert says, the author. She goes, fear is a really useful thing because it can save your life. It can stop you from going down that alleyway, letting that person into your car. But at the same time, you don't want fear in the driver's seat of the car. You don't want fear choosing the food or the music or the snacks for the journey. You want fear in the back seat. So I think the self-awareness of what are my fears is something just to be aware of. And for me, ensuring as much as possible that I'm acknowledging the fears, but acting not driven by them, because then I'm going to be constricted. Fear is constricting. It's narrow. It's not expansive and purposeful and meaningful for me anyway. In a practical sense, a big part of it probably is letting go of the need for external validation, because people around you, depending on who you're around, might think you're a bit crazy, may disapprove. It's a real Brown thing. We really want our parents to be proud of us and approve of all of our choices and to be okay. Like, my parents may not understand this. They lived in a different context and time, not driven by the same reasons to make decisions, and they're not going to understand this. So having the resilience and being willing to accept that people may not understand, people may question you, people may challenge you, And what perhaps helps with that is being really self-confident and sure as to why you're doing this. It might be an intellectual why, but more often for me is a feeling like this really feels like the right thing to do. I don't want to regret this. I don't want to resent not having tried at least. And so having a lot of conviction in terms of the why, be it a feeling or be it a kind of bigger articulated vision, I think can give us the propelling, the propellant to kind of move through that, the questions from others, and just the inner work to be more self-accepting. Like in a capitalist world, I feel often our sense of self-worth comes from how much we're making, or even in the impact space, how busy I am or how much impact I'm creating. For me, both of those are quite capitalist and destructive. And it was something I'd say struggled with, because ironically, I left this 24-hour job, went to this NGO in India, and still worked even harder. And there were points where I was still not sleeping, Angela. And rather than my value coming from the feedback from my seniors in consulting, it was now from how much impact are we creating? And that was still problematic and still leading to burnout and still not really that well. And so that's been probably a much longer journey that's still ongoing, but it's taken a number of years to really look at, why do I do what I do, and how much of it's driven by guilt or pressure, be it from parents or society, or even a personal sense of, I had a story or a belief, I can't rest while other people suffer, which just led to so much burnout. And I think you find this with a lot of social entrepreneurs or change makers. It's often a trauma or a story like this that's motivating their efforts. And that's where having my own coaches, my own support system to help me do that inner healing and feel like I'm enough as I am, regardless of what I do, how busy I am, how much impact I apparently create, how much money I make. I'm a human, and that's enough. And that journey's been a much harder journey. You making a transition won't change anything. Those inner wounds or those inner stories need, I think, a lot of considered work and often help from others. At least I've needed in my case, and I've needed to, I'd really enjoy supporting others with, to really help the longer term sustainable change for a much more purposeful, values aligned life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like you said, I think people think, oh, the hard thing is just figuring out what your purpose is, and then once you make that switch, then it's like it feels great all the time. I think the best way to think about it is more that you feel more centered. You feel like all the things going around you, you can sway with it, but you won't kind of be completely uprooted. And so it gives you a bit more of an anchor, but it doesn't sort of suddenly make your life beautiful and magical and free of pain and suffering.
Yeah.
But maybe, like share with us a little bit about then, if through this experience, obviously you're still transitioning in some ways, but what is it like now? How is your life different now that you've made that choice? You're deliberately choosing things that are more purposeful. And what have you, maybe share a little bit about what your coaching work is like, because it sounds like that's been the main vehicle in which you've stepped into to live your life and not have it be defined to you by others.
Yeah. What does my life look like now? Much more balanced. And it's again something I feel privileged to be able to enjoy. There's time in the garden, time with friends, time with family, reading, and my meditation and community service. It's much more well-rounded rather than defined or identified with a specific aspect. So that's something I find so nourishing, and really I watch myself, because sometimes the mind gets greedy. I had a whole bunch of coaching clients reach out at the end of last year, and the greedy mind is like, oh, what if you could help all of them? But that would just lead to me losing my balance. So really being aware of the cost of growth and the pace of growth that is healthy and that's doable without compromising balance, which is, I know, where a lot of my well-being and overall sense of happiness or fulfillment comes from. So that's been one thing. In terms of work specifically, I think where I found a sense of like purpose or fulfillment is kind of the intersection of what are the things that I enjoy, love thinking about, love talking about, what are some of my natural strengths, and what is the need or the way I can support others. So some of the things I love thinking about is transforming capitalism. I'm still fascinated by shifting business and our economic system. I'm fascinated by all kinds of social issues, be it ecological issues or more of the social or inequalities, and how I feel really drawn and committed, not even interested, but like committed to wanting to address some of those. I notice I am fascinated by inner work and our mindset and our well-being and who we are in an inside-out way. I know I have a natural strength around connection, conversation, empathy, listening, presence. And so, and those are, of course, things I need to nurture. But as I look at that together, that one expression of that is through coaching work and facilitation work. And my own theory of change now, Angela, is if we want to transform these big systems or the way we do business or the way we make policy, we need to start by shifting the leaders. It's people that shape systems, and systems that, of course, that shape people. So how can I nurture the kind of business leaders that are really driven by values, that are really driven by compassion and care, that are also pragmatic and building businesses that can thrive and support them financially and then provide work for others? But who are these next generation of business leaders that are shifting the status quo, that are doing business in a profoundly regenerative and non-extractive way, that are challenging the capitalist notion? And that's been, one space where I feel there's a beautiful sense of alignment. And with a lot of my clients, it's often, figuring out the same thing. What are their strengths? What are their interests? What mission calls them? For some of them, it's more inclusive technology sector. For someone else, it's how do I do climate consulting work in a way that supports companies to reduce their emissions? It's all kinds of missions that draw them, but it's helping them figure out, okay, maybe for me, I've got technical skills. Maybe for me, I'm more of an entrepreneur. And how do we find that sense of alignment, that sense of harmony? And that's been really fulfilling. And in this work, it's quite fun because as you serve others, you serve yourself. I think it's with anything that's big, and you probably feel the same with Clearhead. In doing this work, you learn so much, you benefit so much. And so actually you're rewarded in a much more profound way. It's not just about the financial up, but the amount I learn and receive, and the kind of fulfillment I feel is far deeper. And it's something I do for free anyway. It's great to get paid for it. I spend my days doing this anyway, if I could.
Which is kind of what most people often say when they find their purpose, is that like, oh, I do this for free, but hey, great that I'm getting paid for it. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in talking about like the benefits of getting it right. Like my parents are Buddhists. I don't really subscribe to any religion, but I would say that running the business over the last 4.5 years have been an incredibly spiritual experience for me. That I think is probably when I've really tapped into spirituality, when you have to make meaning with like the ups and downs of life, and some decision, like bad things happen to good people. And it's just like, and then you see good things happen to bad people, and you're like, I don't understand. This is so unfair. And like, why does this happen? And making meaning out of that, is really important. And I think, as you said, when I think back about my life, and sort of like struggling through medical school, I mean, I I I I I had class averages that were like A plus, and I think I was like a B student, and I was like, oh, I'm such a failure. I'm such a bad doctor. This is not, I'm not meant for the profession. And that was what started my journey, is just recognizing that I'm it's not that like I'm failing, but I'm not thriving. I'm working so hard just to keep up with people, because I was playing on strengths that was not mine. And I think that like when you think about finding your purpose, like there are two things. One is, like you said, the value piece that we've talked about, doing the inner work to figure out what that is. But the other thing is also to think about what is your strengths, and I remember that, like, there was this one moment where I thought to myself, I was like, actually stop beating yourself up about this. Like, if a fish is assessed to climb a tree, it will think that it's like a terrible fish, but that's not its strength. And so I think for me is figuring out, like, what markers do I want to be judged by, and those markers can be defined by you, not by society. And that's part of what those boundary settings is. If you don't even know what your boundaries are, how can you expect others to know what that is? It has to start with you. I think often we go through our education system being told what to do, what the answer is, and so then we go out into the work environment, and suddenly there is no one to parent us, no one to tell us, here's how you set your boundaries. And then so we in the absence of that, like that space gets filled. And sometimes if you have a great leader that's compassionate and
Mm,
can coach you, then great. But
mm,
most people are busy dealing with their own shit, to be honest. And so, they're not thinking about you and what you need and what your balance is. Only you can
yeah.
tell them that. So I think that's really important, I think, when we think about it. Like, so let's talk about practical tools that our listeners can take away to kind of really embark on this journey that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, beautiful. And I just wanted to also clarify, I don't think even the narrative of finding our purpose is interesting because I don't think we ever find it. And I don't think it's a thing I could even describe. I mean, I could try and put words to it, but it's almost a feeling of moment to moment. Am I living in tune with myself, my higher self, or my, living through my conditionings, my insecurities, my fears, my pressures? And so for me, the context of the tools will be not so much about saying this is my purpose, I exist to do X and Y, but more moment to moment, am I living with alignment as opposed to living, by pressures, fears, insecurities, like that? What's really driving me? I think one, I'm sure you've talked about this a lot, is having space for stillness daily, non-negotiable. For me, this looks like in the morning, I do some meditation, some chanting. There's so many practices. And the other part for me is every evening I try every evening, doesn't happen every evening, but to go for a walk for an hour to a park nearby and just be with nature. And I find nature for me is an amazing place to be still, not taking my phone, not listening to podcasts, not talking to people, but really just being quiet, and some integration of quietness into your day. I think some kind of mindfulness practice, be it an active practice, be it yoga or movement. I think even meditation itself is sort of non-negotiable to survive the crazy antics. The world is constantly like this, and just have a moment for everything to settle. And in that quietness is when things become clear, when it becomes apparent, oh, this doesn't feel aligned, or that is frustrating, or this, oh my God, that's what's been calling me, I just didn't notice, or this is the thing I need to do next, I've known all along. Like, so much gets clear in that space of stillness and quiet. So I think that for me is like a baseline practice. For me, journaling is also really helpful. I'm quite a cognitive person, so journaling and also talking to my coaches, both I think are practices where I can process some of the things that are coming up. I'm worried about this. I'm scared about this. I'm noticing this. I'm noticing I thought this about myself, but actually this. I thought I would hate this. I'm noticing a lot of resistance around this. So having a space, I think journaling can be great. Having a person, a coach, a therapist, a partner, even a friend, seeing what's around you that you can tap into, a tree or a plant, even, honestly, can be amazing to talk to kind of process what you're learning. I think a purpose-driven life is a life where we're constantly learning and growing and changing and not rigidly defining who we are, but being open to be shaped by life and its experiences. And then perhaps the final thing is just being really honest with yourself and asking yourself some of the very hard questions and making space. Often we just avoid this and avoid this and avoid this, and eventually life slapped me in the face with a 24-hour day and forced me to look at it. I probably could have asked these questions much earlier if I was brave enough and sincere enough. So why am I doing what I'm doing? Like, what is it that I really want out of this? If money didn't matter, what would I do? If impact didn't matter, what would I do? What do I want to stay up all night talking about? What do I find myself naturally drawn to and curious by? What lessons might this experience be designed to teach me? And I think being brave to ask those questions. Why do I keep creating, not feeling like a victim, but why do I keep creating this situation? Why do I keep creating situations where people keep exploiting me in this way, or I keep burning myself out? What's going on for me? I think is also just so powerful and game changing, and can really support us in making purpose and meaning and joy part of our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think the key starting point is, as you said, do you create spaces for stillness? And the reason for that is all the questions that Shruti just rattled off. They can't happen if you're busy scrolling on social media. They can't happen if you're going to party after party. They can't happen if you are so consumed by your work. And it's in those stillness where most people actually avoid it because they are afraid of the questions that come. Those, you and I have sat with those questions for probably at least 10 to 20 years of our lives. And, sometimes we don't like the answer. Sometimes we fight what we need to do. But ultimately, I think we are open enough to listen. And if you take the time to listen and observe and learn, the answers will come. But it's whether you take that first step of being able to not be afraid of what will come in the stillness, the questions that are asked, the answers that will be confronting, which is like, I'm not happy in my job, I'm not happy in my relationship, maybe I shouldn't have been a mom, and that, how scary is that? You brought a kid up, and now you say, like, maybe I shouldn't have been a mom. Those are confronting questions that you have to work through. And I think what's really important to highlight is even someone like Shruthi, who is a coach, has a coach in herself. And I sort of really want to stress that, I think, when we think about therapy, it's still very much like, oh, you only need therapy when you're going through divorce, or you need therapy when, like, you're having suicidal thoughts. And I really want to stress that, like, where the world is going is to be proactive, talking to professionals who can sit with you, no judgment. They've seen it before. It will be incredibly freeing for you, or at least reassuring. So, look, I think most companies have what we call EAP in place. Clearhead is one of them. And if your employer is culturally progressive, then they will see that you using EAP as a way of getting yourself to a better headspace, and therefore to be more productive and more fulfilled, etc. So yeah, don't see these options of asking for professional help as a way of, like, weakness, but actually just as a way of filling your cup more. And even if you're not quite ready to get to, like, I want to talk to a professional, there's so many self-help tools, right? So for example, Clearhead, there's like a mood tracker. And so in that mood tracker, then you can do some of the stuff Shruti said, which is very much, by logging your mood or journaling regularly, you start to see your triggers. You start to see the patterns of, like, why am I always getting into these abusive relationships? And you can start piecing together some stuff. You might not be able to connect the dots completely yourself. That's why you bring a professional in. So, really thinking about, like, you don't have to figure this out alone. Like, life is hard enough. There is support available. So please make use of it, I think. Shruti, we've had a really good conversation, and I'm, like, mindful of time. So, like, what are the, maybe just to kind of finish off, they're sort of, one of your key tools you've talked about is meditation. And I know you've done Vipassana as well in the past. And obviously you're really passionate about, like, sort of the wisdom and traditions of indigenous and, Eastern and Western knowledge systems. Maybe, can you talk, sort of share a little bit about what you've learned through doing all of those things, and as a way of sort of, like, sort of closing out a bit of the session.
Oh, so many lifetimes of learning, Angela. I'm not even sure where to begin. I think maybe the biggest thing that is resonating or coming up for me now is our entire education system, or my experience with education in New Zealand. I'm grateful for a very quality education, but it's come from a value system that is, like, Western and capitalist, and sees humans as separate from each other and separate from nature, and has all this, it's one of competition. I think about how I learned economics in school. I think about how I've learned science. I mean, a lot of it's useful, but it's one way of understanding or looking at reality. And I feel that was the only way I had. It was the glasses I wore to see the world for so much of my life. And it's been in more recent years of really, and I think part of it's in New Zealand with just the elevation of the Māori worldview, that we're now beginning to see there's entirely different ways of understanding who we are and why we're here and what we are. Like, who am I? And, like, in a Vedantic point of view, like, you don't exist. Like, the personality Shruthi does not exist. Like, we can go into that as a separate conversation, but there are so many different ways of understanding who we are and why we're here and how we relate to each other and how we relate to all of life. And a lot of the indigenous and more Eastern and ancient Western practices come from more of a space of oneness, interconnectedness, which has a lot of consequences for what that means for well-being, for how I spend my time, for what I value, for how I treat others, how I treat nature, what I choose to do for work, what industries might exist or not exist. There's a lot of very practical consequences. So I think one thing that's just been helpful in my own journey is realizing wow, most of our society, the way we design our houses, the way we design our streets, the way we educate, the way we organize, the way we meet, the way we eat, the fact that I sit on a table. In my tradition, I'd sit on the floor, much better for digestion. I would eat off a banana leaf, much more sustainable. Like, there's entirely different ways of doing everything. And I think the decolonization movement for me is super exciting, because we can acknowledge there are some gifts from all of these traditions, and modern Western science has helped us make huge leaps and bounds in technology and, you know, medical care and treatment. There's amazing gifts we can take, and there's some values in our indigenous and Eastern and our own cultures. And so maybe my invitation for you is, you know, what might your own culture have to offer you that you're yet to discover, and going far, you know, back enough, and what might other cultural worldviews have to offer you that might actually challenge your entire way of conceiving who you are and why you're here and what life is all about. And it's kind of, as you were saying earlier, Angela, confronting, because our whole realities are built off certain beliefs, and when we begin to realize, oh, that might not all be real, there might be an entirely different story going on. It's kind of freeing and liberating, terrifying, and there's so much gifts in that. So I think, yeah, that journey's been huge. It's very much ongoing, and I'm really excited by the potential in New Zealand with, you know, our Māori roots, our kind of relation with the crown, and our multiculturalism, how we can draw on the rich knowledge and wisdom of different traditions and creating a society that really fosters well-being for everyone.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm really hearing from you is, you know, don't be afraid to question. I think, again, we are conditioned to think that, like, that there is one way of doing things, and that there's this all-knowing being, you know, like when we were children, that our parents knew all the answers. And then when we became parents ourselves, we're like, oh, wow, our parents were probably winging it the whole time. And just really thinking about that, you know, these things that sometimes provide us so much unhappiness are roles that might be set on ourselves, whether consciously or unconsciously, that we can challenge, we can question, we can say, hey, I don't want to walk the straight and narrow path. I'm gonna try that, you know. And I want to share, you know, like one of my favorite comics growing up was Calvin and Hobbes. And I always think about this particular strip when we talk about conversations like this, such as, like, there's this sort of two conversational bubble, which, you know, what Calvin just said to Hobbes, you know, if people sat outside and looked at the stars every night, I bet they would live a lot differently. Hobbes was like, oh, how so? And Calvin just said, well, when you look into infinity, you realize there are more important things than what people do all day. And, you know, like, I think, you know, those are those paradigms that I want us to question. You know, why, you know, like, why spend all your day in meetings, and why spend all your days replying emails? Like, you might have to. Like, I'm not saying that you don't have to. I'm just saying, like, question it. You know, sometimes there are things that we do in our lives that have become comfortable and routine, and in that comfort, we become complacent, and then we feel like life is boring and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. So anyway, to any final words from you, Shruthi, before we close it off?
Maybe the last thought is, you've probably heard lots of ideas and thoughts here. Don't feel like this is a to-do list of things to do. For me, well-being and purpose is a journey of being. So yeah, just to, maybe there's one thing that resonates in your heart and you follow that, but just to, yeah, not feel overwhelmed that I've now got to ask all these questions and do all these things. Like, really trust yourself, follow your own wisdom. And for me, it starts with who we are, and that translates into what we do and how we speak and everything else. So just, yeah, that would be my last thought. And thank you. Yeah, just gratitude, Angela, for creating the space to have this conversation, and to all of you for joining and listening.
Oh, awesome. Well, we like to close our sessions off with our guests with one question. What is your go-to well-being practice, or the one well-being practice that you do? Yeah, share it with us before we close off the session.
I already shared it, but time in nature. And I love the stars thing. I try and do this before I go to bed, actually, look at the stars for a few moments. But definitely time in nature, my hands in the dirt if I can, bare feet on the grass. I think nature is one of the most amazing healers, and we're so lucky to have access to her so easily in New Zealand, which most countries in the world don't have parks in the way we do. And I feel so grateful to have green space and nature to support us.
Yeah, truly equitable is one of those things that costs nothing to do but brings so much joy and calmness in you. It's what I do at least a few times a week as well. Just go for a run, sit by this tree. I call it my Pocahontas tree, and I'm just there in the moment. So thank you everyone for joining us and listen to the wonderful, lovely Shruthi Vijayakumar sharing her thoughts on what it means to coach your way into a more purposeful life. That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.